Hello, everybody. Welcome to Colorado Classics Day, and thanks for attending my talk here this morning. That'll maybe bleed just a little bit in this afternoon, probably not too much if it does at all. My name's Travis Rupp. I'm a teacher at. Welcome to Colorado Classics Day, and thanks for attending. Hold on one second. I'm getting a repeat over here. Sorry about that. Let's see. So anyway, as I was saying, sorry, I had it streaming on my YouTube at the same time, so I was getting an echo. But thank you all for attending. My name's Travis, and I teach at the University of Colorado, Boulder. I teach in classics, art history, history and anthropology, and then I'll also be teaching some classes in mechanical engineering coming up in the spring. My focus is primarily archaeology, and I mostly focus on the Roman world, but having taught at the university here now for about 10 years, my interests have certainly expanded, and what we end up getting focused on can change from time to time. So I work a lot on Pompeii, also ancient food and drink is a topic I work on quite a bit, but I also am one of the professors that teaches Egyptian art and archaeology. And so I thought today would be fun to dive into a little bit of that topic and talk about the Sphinx in particular. So let me go ahead and share my screen here with you all, and we'll kind of start walking through the topic. So, get this over here. Currently, I'm actually teaching a class on this very topic. I teach survey classes on Greek art and archaeology, Roman art and archaeology, and Egyptian. And right now, I'm teaching this class to approximately 300 students, so it's a big course. But a topic that is always of great interest to my students is the Sphinx. I mean, I think it's probably one of the most recognizable pieces of art, not even in the classical world alone, but on the planet. It is also the largest monolithic statue that exists on the planet, meaning that it was built out of one piece of stone. Now, the image you see in the background might not make it seem as though it's built out of one piece, mainly because you'll notice around the paws and the legs and the body of the Sphinx, there's a lot of what appears to be brickwork. And I'll talk a little bit about that in just a little bit in regards to the restoration projects that have been undertaken on the monument over the years, because there have been a lot of them over the course of its history. But also, you know, if you turn on, I think I'm like all of you, I was very interested in ancient Egypt as a kid. And one of the things that, you know, you latch onto, especially when you're a little toddler, is the Sphinx. It's one of those most recognizable symbols from the ancient Mediterranean world. But for all its grandeur and all of its importance to the study of Egyptology, who built it and why it was built is still kind of wrapped up in mystery and controversy. There is certainly one predominant theory, which is that it's Khafre's construct, because it does seem to be affiliated with Khafre's pyramid complex. But as you'll see today, that just because it's affiliated with Khafre's pyramid complex doesn't necessarily mean that he was the one that built it. So the goal here is to kind of run through those the various theories that do exist on why the Sphinx was built, who built it, when they built it. And also, as you'll note, with ancient Egyptian study or Egyptology, you know, you turn on National Geographic channel and any given time of the day, you're probably going to find a documentary on ancient Egypt that's streaming there. But they kind of, I think one perception that's a little bit falsified by big institutions like Nat Geo is that we know everything about the ancient Egyptians. You would think for a civilization that dates back at least 5,000 years in its dynastic tradition, and even earlier than that potentially, looking at the pre-dynastic era of Egypt, you would think we know a lot about it, or we know at least kind of all of the really integral inner workings of that culture. And even the most notable of monuments are still very much cloaked in mystery. Now, before I dive into just talking about the Sphinx, I mean, we obviously have to talk about the Giza Plateau and where it's located. And just to that same idea that you would think we know a lot or all about these structures and why they were built, there are still major finds and controversial topics that are being explored in the construction of all three of these pyramids, and most notably the largest one on the far right, the Pyramid of Khufu, or the Great Pyramid. And that's because a lot of documentation that we have about these from antiquity comes way, way late. In many instances, there aren't really hardly any breadth of good literary material to explore from the Old Kingdom itself when these were built in the fourth dynasty. And so a lot of references come from way later in Egyptian history, as we will see with the Sphinx today. Also, when it comes to understanding the dynastic system of ancient Egypt, nobody really ventured to write down a full eclectic lineage of all the rulers of Egyptian history until Egyptian autonomy was almost completely gone. It wasn't until Manetho or Manetho, depending on how you pronounce his name, a Greek individual wrote it all down very, very late in Egyptian history. And so there's a lot of pieces of the puzzle to be put back together. When it comes to the Giza Plateau, some of the more interesting finds as of late have certainly focused on the Sphinx, but also, as you can see in the bottom image in the red circle, a lot of attention given to the workman's village at the locale that's allowed us to understand a little bit better what it meant to build these pyramids and how they were built. And as we explore in my Egyptian class, we spend almost 2 weeks just on this one feature of Egyptian history, that is the Giza Plateau, and talking about the energetics of pyramid building and how long it really did take them to build it, or how long it could have taken them to build these structures, and trying to put to bed some of the falsified New Age theories that are out there about it being built by some super civilization that we know nothing about, or as has been very popularized by TV, television shows, aliens, right? That they build it, and of course, that's certainly not the case. Humans could have easily built these things in a much quicker time than had been previously presumed. And just as a side note to that, before we do dive into the Sphinx, if you're curious at all about that idea or theory, it was, you know, a lot of times in order to fully understand how these things were undertaken, we have to conduct experimental archaeology. And that's what one of the most famous Egyptologists today undertook back in the late 90s, Mark Lenner. He hired a mason by the name of Roger Hopkins as well to do a special for Nova. And it's a really old Nova special, but if you can hunt it down, it's worth a watch. It's pretty entertaining. They built a pyramid in miniature, trying to employ ancient methodologies and techniques from the Egyptian world. And they proved some interesting things about how it could have been built and how quickly it could have been built as well. Of course, Lenner and Hopkins couldn't have done this without a very extensive understanding of how the pyramid of Khufu worked, and understanding that though the most famous, one of the most famous pyramids, the Step Pyramid of Djoser that was built in the third dynasty, though it still maintains its stepped feature, a lot of times it goes undernoticed or understudied when it comes to the fact that all the pyramids were in fact stepped constructs, and then they were just cased with casing stones to give them this smoother, more beautiful sheen to the construct. And so when they employed their techniques and their methodologies to build this old pyramid, this tiny pyramid in scale, they did undertake it in that way, but they also had to figure out a lot of other major questions and controversies in the field regarding how one builds a pyramid. There are a multitude of papers written and theories out there on how the ramp could have been built around the pyramids in order to bring the blocks up and put them in place. And some of them seem completely implausible because of the amount of material that might be needed. For example, letter B on the screen, this idea of one large ramp that just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger as they climbed the pyramid with the stones. And the problem with that theory is the length of that ramp would have been exponential, and it would have required more material to build the ramp than the pyramid itself. And so still some questions on exactly how that was all employed. Lenner and his team decided to employ basically letter C, doing a wrap around the exterior, which is one of the more commonly accepted theories of how the stones were put into place. But even in that regard, when it comes down to exactly what he figured out, and what we'll be seeing with the Sphinx here as well, is that these things, though they seem otherworldly and so magnificent in their scale, and you know, almost implausible in the way that they could have been built in one person's lifetime, what Lenner proved was really important. His study of the energetics showed that the 250 work crews that we are almost certain worked on Khufu's pyramid, could have built the entire thing in only 1.16 years. Now, that's really amazing. I mean, it's absolutely impressive to think that something of that scale, one of the largest structures or monuments in the world, could have been built so quickly using such rudimentary methods of copper chisels and purely manpower, literally physical manpower to move them into place. Now, of course, that would be them working essentially year round, at least as Leonard put it, somewhere around 300 days out of the year, moving stones into place. And that's probably not what happened. It's more likely that most of the crews were being employed for about a 90-day period, specifically during the growing season, when there's not nearly as much work to do in the fields, because Egypt was based on an agrarian economic system. They produced more agricultural product than anywhere else or any other empire in the ancient Mediterranean. And so potentially 90-day work year would still get it done in 9.5 years, which is really, really amazing, because most theories prior to this said it must have taken the full lifetime of Khufu, at least 20 years during his reign as king, maybe even upwards of 30 years. But again, this is all employed, all of these theories were employed using what we call the energetics of building, and looking exactly at what man can do, employing experimental archaeology, and then even employing art to help validate it. In the bottom image, you see from this one in particular tomb relief, them pulling, these individuals pulling a statue into place. And what is wonderful about Egyptian art is that they rarely just land on weird numbers and odd facts in their literature because they just decided to. It's more very intentional. Usually, if they're going to show us exactly 172 men pulling a statue, then there probably were 172 men pulling that statue into place. And so that helps understand the energetics of building a little bit better as well. Lastly, in regards to the pyramids, before we talk just about the Sphinx, there are theories still coming out today that are highly controversial. And I will tell you, this one is not a widely accepted theory at all, but this is what makes the study of classics and Egyptology so fascinating and wonderful, because you would, again, things that are so old and cultures that have been dead and gone for thousands of years still keep us wondering and keep us thinking exactly how they did what they did. And Jean-Pierre Houdin, in a series of papers from 06 to 08, argued that the pyramids were built from the inside out. He literally argued that there was a ramp on the interior and that they built from the outer edge of each tier inward. His theory was based on density scans that were undertaken of the Great Pyramid of Khufu that shows what he thinks are a series of very regular chasms or fissures or some kind of essentially tunnel system that exists on the inside of the pyramid where these old channels must be. And of course, none of these causeways or tunnels have been found inside the interior of the structure, but it was certainly food for thought and led to a whole another series of arguments about the monument. Regardless, though, when it comes to the pyramids, it does not take that long to build Khufu's pyramid. As I say, 10 to 20 years out of a 23-year reign is very, very doable. And still, though, there is so much to be explored about one of the most notable features in Egyptology, because we have to take into account a lot of things that aren't easily discernible from the archaeological record, like staging, organizing, dragging routes, so on and so forth, as you can see in my last bullet on this slide. But it could have been done. It did not require aliens to build the thing, and it's not some super civilization that we can't understand or know nothing about. Even so much so that just a couple of years back, I think it was about 3 years ago, some new documentation was found to show exactly where some of the blocks were coming from for Khufu's pyramid. A lot of them were mined right there on the Giza Plateau, right next to the Sphinx, consequently. But there certainly were, they needed to bring in stone from outside sources as well, because the quarries could not provide the volume needed or necessitated. And this, what's wonderful about the Egyptian topography is that it's so arid and dry that it preserves papyri really quite nicely. And this one was found in a quarry near the Red Sea at Wadi al-Jarf that actually talks about blocks being moved to build Khufu's pyramid. But in regards to the quarries and the building blocks that were needed, it's a nice segue to the Sphinx and talking a little bit about how it was built and why it was built, because it has been noted that the pit or the kind of defining walls that exist around the area of the Sphinx were mined out in antiquity for their stone, for the limestone there. And a lot of the blocks that would have been quarried out from around the base of the Sphinx have been found in the pyramids of both Khufu and Khafre, most notably Khufu, though, and they show the same levels of erosion, so on and so forth, and in some of its portions. So it seems very plausible that when the Sphinx kind of was dawned, or when it was born in this area, that it was being done around the same time that they were quarrying out a lot of the stone. But the predominant theory, as I said, is that Khafre built it, because as you can see from this image, the Sphinx sits almost directly on a kind of an axial symmetry with the pyramid of Khafre. And this would place its building around 2575 to 2465. But one of the reasons why it's been so heavily discussed, or it's not just rooted in stone that it's definitely Khafre, has to do with a milieu of evidence regarding erosion around the structure, potential recarving of the Sphinx at various points in history, and then also the fact that Khafre's causeway, that's the line you see coming off of the mortuary temple that's attached to the front of Khafre's pyramid, that causeway veers off, as you can see, to the south, and it seems to be intentionally veering off to avoid the Sphinx. And Mark Lenner has argued that that's almost indicative or absolutely firm evidence that the Sphinx may have, that the Sphinx likely did exist there prior to the building of the pyramid, because why not then just have the causeway come straight out to the Nile valley and avoid having to do this kind of circuitous or this angular pattern to avoid it, which is certainly food for thought. So let's talk a little bit about all of these major scholars in the field and their theories and as to potentially how or when it was built. And again, people like Zahi Hawass, who we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment as well, very notable individual in Egyptian archaeology. He's one of those guys that you see in every documentary on TV, because he is one of the preeminent scholars and was in charge of Egyptian antiquities for years and years and years. And he's a firm believer that it's affiliated with the Khafre complex, but he also notes that it's a very complicated topic or complicated issue, because as soon as Khafre, or I should say, as soon as Khufu was done with his complex, or as soon as he was interred in it, to make his transition to the afterlife and live on as a god, it wasn't as though there was this long-standing period of time where nobody was building at Giza. It was probably almost immediate, within weeks or months, that they started building the next structure in the vicinity. Or if there was a gap, it was a very short gap while Jedefre, the oldest son of Khufu, ruled for a period of time. And then when Khafre comes in, he was going to build his complex almost immediately. One thing about the Egyptians is that you could easily comment on is that they seem to spend more time working on the afterlife and preparing for the next realm than they do for aggrandizement in the world of the living, because a lot of what we learn about ancient Egyptians come from their necropoli, from their cities for the dead, not for or from their cities for the living. But to come back to the Sphinx and this idea that Khafre was the one that built it, even if he didn't build it, certainly he worked really, really hard to ensure that his complex involved it or were affiliated with it. I mean, the Sphinx is points to the east and is on this perfect axial linear line to the east with the pyramid of Khafre. Also, when Khafre built his structure, you can see that as the causeway veers off, it does finish at a valley temple for the deceased god king, and that valley temple was directly correlated with, or almost seemingly attached to, the Sphinx temple that existed in front of it. Before, if it was something that Khafre built, we would hope to have a lot of discussion about it throughout Egyptian history. And what is really, really interesting is that we don't. As a matter of fact, the oldest or the earliest piece of literature, you might say, that was written about the Sphinx comes from Thutmose IV, who was a New Kingdom king from the 18th dynasty, and you could almost say he was vacationing up in that area of the Giza Plateau, and we hear basically from this dream stela that it was in really bad shape. And why would we say vacationing? Well, think about the fact that our history in the United States is very, very short so far. I mean, what, we're 240 or so, 245 years old. We're really not that old of a nation or a major, if you will, imperial presence in the world. But when Thutmose IV finally made his way to the Giza Plateau, the Sphinx had already been standing there for probably about 1,100 years, if Khafre was the one that built it. And he tells us that it was in pretty bad shape. Supposedly, according to the stela, which you see right between the paws of the Sphinx, he fell asleep, took a nap underneath its chin, which was still kind of poking up out of the ground. And a god came to him. It was Horum Akhet Capri Reatum, or Horus on the horizon, sun god in the morning, day and night. And he appeared to him in this dream as a sphinx. And he basically said, clear away the sand and you will become the ruler of the dual lands, or of Upper and Lower Egypt. And this is awesome to have this literary reference right in front of the Sphinx, telling us of basically a restoration effort that was undertaken. But it still comes so late. 1,100 years old the Sphinx was when Thutmose IV visited it. He supposedly did restore it, but what was the Sphinx supposed to be? We don't really hear a whole lot about what it's supposed to be. It's a representation maybe of the sun god, a theory that we'll talk more about in a moment. But still, who was the original builder? He doesn't reference that. Were later kings trying to associate themselves with people like Khufu and Khafre because of the phenomenal nature of their buildings? Was it just to be an icon of kingship? Again, so many questions based in, because this one piece of literature is not all that robust. It really doesn't tell us about the history of it by the time Thutmose IV discovers it. If we go back as far as we can in time and literally talk about its makeup, what it's made out of, it is a little bit telling as to why it looks the way it is, as we try to explore potentially how old it might be. Geologically, the Sphinx and the little pit that it sits in is a part of what's called the Macadam Formation, and it is the product of marine sediments that when this was all oceanic, and this is maybe some 50 million years ago. So this was once all water-based area, coral reef, shoal, that kind of thing that was in this spot. And of course, once the water receded, it hardened, and it turned into the stone outcropping along the Nile that was there when they started carving it. Now, one of the reasons the facial features are much better preserved than the lower part of the body has to do with the layers of sediment that were laid down. And in fact, member 3, which is the face, the head, is the hardest, which is why it's better preserved. And the lower parts have eroded away. Now, consequently, a lot of the stones that were found in the pyramids, because they're being quarried right here, are from members 1 and 2. And so they show similar erosion patterns, but they're not maybe as overt or as drastic as some of the erosion patterns that are found around the Sphinx, because they're not directly exposed to the elements like the Sphinx is. Now, over the course of its history, too, it's undergone a lot of restoration and reconstruction, you might say, but there is a huge, huge gap between the Greco-Roman period and Baresi's excavations in the early 20th century, where it kind of was just lost to the elements once again. I mean, Napoleon eventually made his way here during his expeditions eastward, as he was trying to conquer the world, of course. And when he came upon the Sphinx, it supposedly was almost back into that state that it was in when Thutmose IV found it. It had been completely consumed by the desert. And these watercolors and sketches were done by artists employed by Napoleon to take note of what it looked like at that time. fast forward a little bit more, and we come into eventually the cusp of the turn of the 20th century, I guess you might say, the late 19th century, and then into the early 20th. There were early excavations and explorations undertaken even in the 1870s, and various daguerreotypes were taken of the state or the status of the Sphinx at that time. But again, it was just more kind of clear away some of the sand or not even do anything much at all, in some instances where they were just exploring what was exposed above ground because it was going to be such a monumental feat to try to clear the sand away. And in the 20th century, then the 1920s, that's when that was eventually undertaken. Baresi, he worked extensively on the Sphinx and what you might call an excavation effort. He did clear away the sand. He tried to restore or repair parts of the Sphinx. But the problem with this excavation or this archaeological undertaking is that records were not very well kept. Now, luckily, there were a few images that have been taken, like the one you can see in the upper right-hand corner of those efforts to try to expose the Sphinx. But really, Baresi did, you could almost argue he did just as much damage as he did good. We know that he found a tunnel that started at the rump of the Sphinx. And he did note that it's a very odd fissure near the rump of the Sphinx that almost gives the impression as though the Sphinx was later elongated, because when you look at it, it almost does look out of scale, especially because of the size of the head. The head looks too small for the body. And he proposed that it was elongated to accommodate this tunnel or this fissure that did exist in the rock outcropping. Now, he did explore this tunnel that supposedly extended into the Sphinx somewhere. And there was another chasm that was found behind the head of the Sphinx. You can see that highlighted with the little green dot in the bottom right-hand corner. But what he did upon finding these, or once he was done exploring it, is he filled them in with cement. And we can't really undo what he did. To try to remove the cement would further damage the Sphinx. It really it slammed a door for later archaeologists to really understand what was going on with it. Blocked those interior passages. You can see some of the cement that's been polished on the exterior in the bottom left-hand corner, and then this individual standing next to what remains of a chasm that extends into the Sphinx here in the upper right-hand corner. Now, the question definitely was, what in the world was going on with this passageway, and is there anything left for us to study of it since it was filled in with cement? Well, it did cause a lot of controversial theories to come out. For example, Edgar Cayce, notorious individual amongst New Age Egyptologists, people who do think that this was some super civilization or somebody beyond the Egyptians themselves that built these things. He argued that the Sphinx was some kind of portal to a lost civilization, a lost city, maybe even tied to the myth of Atlantis, and wrote a lot of fantastical literature about what it was for, and that there was maybe even a lost tomb of Osiris or city or palace of Khafre or Khufu that exists under it. All these grandiose and outlandish statements. And they are vastly disproven, but to further disprove it, actually back in 2008 and 2009, Mark Glenner and Zahi Hawass sought to look around the Sphinx to see if there were any of these mystical chasms and things underneath it, and they did not really find anything. Leonard and Hawass did some drilling. They found some tools, basically from the period that we would expect to maybe find there, because this was a quarry at one point. Hawass, oddly enough, went into that tunnel that still remains, that was opened up when they were doing scans along the base of the Sphinx. But he wouldn't allow any cameras to come in with him. And he went down this tunnel, and it was 9 meters long. And he came back out and just said, well, there's nothing down there, it's just a wall. But he wouldn't allow any cameras in. And that's continued to fuel the fires of controversy and skepticism. But regardless of Hawass not allowing people in there, it still did not validate that there were any lost chambers or tombs or anything that existed under the Sphinx for or for study or even to validate Edgar Cayce's theories. But still, who built it? I mean, who was the one who had this monumental sculpture commissioned? And this is a list of some of the theories that have been proposed. Of course, Khafre's is the most predominant, but there are theories that it's a pre-dynastic monument, which would put it before 3000 BCE, that it's maybe just pre-4th dynasty, so in the early Old Kingdom. Maybe it's Khufu's. Maybe it's the oldest son of Khufu, Jedefre, who built it, Khafre, or maybe even none of the above. And to just do a quick survey of the various theories that revolve around this, when it comes to the idea of it being really old, pre-dynastic, there is an ongoing argument and discussion that revolves around what we call the water erosion hypothesis that has to do with not just the Sphinx itself, but analyzing the definitive boundary that sits around it, because it does sit in this kind of pit where stone had been quarried out. And John West and Robert Schoch were the first to kind of lead this theorization that it was old, that it had to date back to 7 to 4000 BCE. And that's because they argued that due to the depth of the fissures that exist in the stone, it must have been due to elongated, prolonged rainfall, somewhere between 10 and 5000 BCE. And they argued that that couldn't have happened during the dynastic period because the geological record shows that basically at the beginning of Egyptian imperial history, right around 3000 BCE, that the rainfall was quite average for many generations, if not hundreds of years. And so this must have come from an earlier period. Now, Leonard and Hawass don't agree with this theory. They do acknowledge the fact that this does appear to be water erosion, not necessarily wind erosion, which is another theory that's been kicked around. But because of the softness, again, of members 1 and 2, it's going to erode quite readily and easily due to various rainfall at various times. Regardless, West and Schoch argued that it was pre-dynastic solar cult that it was built for, but for whom or what civilization is not clear. They don't extend that far. Unfortunately, West died just a few years back, and he had started to go the way of the New Age Egyptologists, arguing that it may be over 30,000 years old. And again, there's no evidence at all to support that. As Hawass has argued, we have no indication that anybody was building anything or even making art, if you will, of any notability prior to the year 5000 BCE, so it can't be that old. But still keeping with that same theory, later on, Colin Reeder picked up and ran with it and argued that it was also water erosion, not wind erosion, but that because, again, of the softness of the limestone, these chasms could have been cut in the early dynastic period. And maybe that it was built for some kind of solar cult. And so he argued that that's what accounts for what appears to be the out of scale head to the body, that originally it was not the face of Khafre or even a king, but that it was a lion. And it was later recarved to look, to take on a human countenance. And that's why, again, it's out of scale. And he also made note of the fact that you can tell one of the problems, he said, with the earlier theory of West and Schoch had to do with rainfall versus water collection and drainage. And he noted that some of the erosion that is predominant in the pit around the Sphinx is due to water collection, not because of really heavy rainfall over extended periods of time. Because you'll note, if you've been there, if you've looked at it in documentaries or books, there is a slope that comes down from the pyramid of Khafre towards the valley. And if there was any kind of rainfall, water is going to run off that plain. And if you've got an open pit, for lack of a better term, around the Sphinx, a lot of water is going to collect there because of the drainage. And he said that's why some of the erosion was a bit more drastic. Melinda Hartwig has argued that the Sphinx was not built by Khafre, but in fact his father Khufu, and that Khufu, it's Khufu's statue of Khufu's face that's on it, predominantly because, or primarily because of the little statue you see in the upper right-hand corner. is the only one statue that we have surviving of Khufu. And she noted that the facial features seem very, very similar. Now, that's stretching it a bit, as I'm sure you guys know, because when you think about Egyptian art, there's a reason why you can walk into a museum and identify the Egyptian hall almost immediately. And it's because artistically, stylistically, things are fairly rigid. You might say lifeless at times. And so from one king to the next, their images and their portraits often look very, very similar. The other thing about that is, I'll just use a little prop, is that that little statue is, I've got my little Darth Vader, it sits on my desk. And you guys can see how small this is. That's about the size of that statue. In fact, it's actually just a little bit smaller than this guy. And so she's comparing that little statue to that huge monumental sculpture of the Sphinx. That might be a little bit of a stretch. But nonetheless, she goes beyond that too, and she argues that the reason why it's Khufu and not Khafre is because we're experiencing the Sphinx the wrong way. That you have to remember that with the Nile flows from the south to the north. And so if you're literally coming down river on the Nile, you're going to be, or I should say, going downriver towards the delta, you're going to see the Sphinx sitting in front of Khufu's pyramid, not in front of Khafre's pyramid, which forces you to look directly to the side and see it sitting in front of the Khafre plain. So she says that it's this. The upper left-hand corner would be the way you're supposed to experience it, not the way it's traditionally experienced today in the bottom left-hand corner. Beyond that theory, then, there's also very famous Egyptologist Salima Ikram, who's done some phenomenal work, and she's also written extensively on funerary architecture in ancient Egypt. She argues that it is, in fact, Djedefre, the often understudied or ignored king who actually came between Khufu and Khafre, who built the Sphinx, or at least had a hand in it, primarily because we know that he worked in the area. He did some stuff on the Giza Plateau. Most notably, his cartouche has been found in and around the Pyramid of Khufu, and even potentially was the one who finished off the solar boat pits where the boats that would carry Khufu into the afterlife were found. So indicating that he was doing some work there, essentially. But the great oddity with that is, though his name is found, the cartouche is found for Djedefre, he didn't build his own pyramid there. And why didn't he? That's a really big question. Why ignore it? He built a pyramid far to the south. It's often referred to as kind of, it's badly damaged and rubble, but kind of the lost pyramid of Djedefre. And why did he ignore the platform to build right next to his father and yet build something else? Ikram would say it's because he was starting to build something, and he was building the Sphinx to either honor his father or himself, and then met his end, and Khafre came into power, and Khafre had something already in place that he had to build alongside of, around, or run with. And that leads us to the most predominant theory, and that's that it is, in fact, Khafre's structure. Many, many people have argued that it is, in fact, a part of his building program. Peter Lacavara spent most of his time working on the topic, but it's also been supported by the likes of Zahi Hawass, probably, again, one of the most notable famous Egyptologists still living today. And they argue that it's all a part of the cult of Khafre, and that it is, in fact, the image of Khafre that the Sphinx bears, and that Lacavara would say the facial features of it are much more readily recognizable, and the statuary of Khafre, which we have many more examples of. He also would go on to say that because of its, again, the most notable thing about it, the most obvious thing, is that it lies on that central axis with the pyramid of Khafre, and therefore he at least had some kind of hand in it. If he didn't build it exclusively himself, he may have done something like recarved the head to be that of himself, or involved it in his complex to take ownership over it. As Hawass has explored, there was a pretty hefty move towards the cult of Khafre and worshiping the sun god. And the Sphinx was maybe more important than the causeway orientation, so it had to remain where it was. Or it also, one thing to note is you got to have the right geological makeup. You have to have a solid piece of bedrock there to build such a monumental statue. And maybe that was the only spot right there in that vicinity that bore a large piece of stone to carve the Sphinx out of to that degree. When it comes to identifying the face of the Sphinx, though, that is probably still one of the biggest debates that's going on about it. And I haven't even listed them all here or even discussed them all today, but it was maybe a lion originally and then recarved. Some have argued it was Anubis, Khufu, Khafre, someone else, or no one specific at all. Maybe it's supposed to be the embodiment of an idea. What is widely presumed is that it is Khafre's, at least part of his complex, and the word Sphinx comes from Shesep Ankh Atum, or the living image of Atum, the first god or god of creation, maybe again elevating the idea that it's more metaphoric. It does have an intimate connection to the temple causeway of Khafre leading to pyramid that makes it his creation. And perhaps it's a part of a sun temple complex, which becomes a very important feature of Egyptian architecture after the Fourth Dynasty. Really at the end of the Fourth Dynasty, solar worship becomes a really, really big deal. Others have said that it's the incarnation of the god Horus. The meanings of it, well, there are a lot of them. Egyptologist Alan Gardner, well-known Egyptian historian, has said that you can remove all of that controversy of who it's supposed to be and look at it in its metaphoric sense, that the Sphinx is the king as a powerful lion, a god as a powerful lion, the king in a leonine form, and a powerful god revealed as the king, essentially all of the above, that it embodies all of these things for the Egyptians. And just to emphasize again that idea, if it is in fact to be more metaphoric in a solar sense, there was a lot of increased emphasis on sun worship. Jedefre, for example, again, a king that is often just overlooked in the Fourth Dynasty, but shouldn't be, was in fact the first to be called son of Ra, the first to bear the name that actually bears the significance, carries the significance of solar worshipped. But still, unfortunately, no text mentioned the Sphinx from the Old Kingdom, so we have to put all of these other pieces together in an attempt to try to make sense of it all. And the redirecting of the causeway and where the Sphinx lies, the orientation between the Sphinx temple and the Khafre temple continue to bear a lot of questions and topics for conversation and discussion. As I said, Lacavara and Hawass have noted that there are many more countenances or portraits of Khafre that remain. And some of them were found actually in or around the Sphinx temple itself, elevating the idea that Khafre took ownership over the Sphinx and tried to make it a part of his propagandistic platform. Must it be a part of Khafre's complex, though? Not for all of its history. I think you could easily say that it was, at least during his reign, but it still doesn't necessarily mean that it wasn't there prior to him. It doesn't mean that he was the one who necessarily established it or built it. In regards to just some things that were added to it in our last couple of minutes in my last couple of slides here, there were things that were done to it throughout history. It has been argued that the beard of the Sphinx may have been added later in the New Kingdom, or that it broke off in antiquity and was put back on in the New Kingdom. Fragments of the beard exist in the British Museum today. It was painted in what we call garish, so it had red, blue, and yellow paint, and it seems, if we date it correctly, that this may have been added in the New Kingdom. And then, of course, there were antiquarian phases of restoration. We already talked about Thutmose IV, but there was even some in the 26th dynasty that patched it. So this is in the late period of Egyptian history. Phase 3 also shows Greco-Roman patching of the soft white limestone, which is really intriguing because though the Romans loved Egyptian culture and tried to almost borrow parts of it and make it part of their own, they didn't often spend that much money to preserve or restore the monuments, but they did for a brief period of time. And other Egyptian kings at least still saw it as a symbol of power. I mean, Amenhotep II, Thutmose IV, and Ramses II all dedicated or made dedications between its paws in the first years of their reign. potentially because they saw it as an embodiment of what they were. They were the chosen Setep, according to their history. And so even though it had been built potentially 1,000 years or more earlier, it still maintained that symbol of power. Clear role as an image of primeval authority, and it would ordain and confirm the position of kings, princes, and continuity with the past. At the same time, it's as the reconstructed Sphinx, New Kingdom pharaohs quarried the stone of Khafre's pyramid for their own buildings too. So we can't overlook the fact that maybe, just maybe, it was built by Khafre or finished by Khafre. Lastly, if we go beyond the controversy, it is the largest monolithic statue in the world and deserves a lot of attention. And if there's anything that can be said about it, beyond who built it, it can be all of these things: a symbol of power, supremacy, divine inspiration, a timeless Egypt, permanence in stone, and conquest over nature. Thank you guys for joining me today for my little 45-minute talk. I really hope to see you down the road in the classics department. Feel free to stick around and ask any questions as well, or you can always email me. I'm just travis.rupp, R-U-P-P, @colorado.edu. And enjoy the rest of your day, guys. Take care.